Camera speed.
Sound production, take one.
Action!
Welcome to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign. If you love old movies, Hollywood history, or the golden age of filmmaking, you've come to the right place. This is the podcast that talks about amazing stories of Tinseltown from another era. Hear fascinating conversations with writer-producer Steve Cubine, who quite literally lives just beneath the Hollywood sign, and actress-writer Nan McNamara. Now your hosts, Steve and Nan.
Steve, I'm really excited to talk about this particular actress today, and I have a sort of a Kevin Bacon 6 degrees of separation thing to Anne Revere.
Oh, I love that.
Not even 6. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it's just 1.
Wow.
One of my first acting jobs in LA was in a TV movie with Jaclyn Smith.
Oh my gosh.
I know, right?
Love
and
her.
Celeste Holm.
Ah, Celeste Holm.
Now, let me tell you, I was thrilled to be in a movie with Jaclyn Smith, but
and
Celeste,
who wouldn't be?
Yeah, exactly. But Celeste Holm was. Talk about a movie star and talk about someone you've watched as
All About Eve, my
Yes,
gosh.
All About Eve, that alone.
Yes.
So I walk into the makeup trailer, and, you know, when you're new to a set, it can be sort of like being the first day at school in high school.
Yes.
And, you know, there's the mean girls, and, you know, which group are you going to get into? And it just is a very intimidating place. It can be. So I sit down in the makeup chair to get my makeup done, and Celeste Holm walks in, and she sits down next to me.
Wow.
And the makeup person said, "Celeste, do you know Nan McNamara?" And Celeste did not miss a beat. And she said, "Oh, of course I do. Nan and I are old friends." And from that moment on, I felt like, oh my gosh, this Academy Award-winning actress has just done the kindest thing to a young, you know, scared actress. So that's my Celeste.
That's amazing.
Holm story, yes.
Well, I think we've mentioned it on other podcasts, you know, that we're so lucky that we were the conduit between old Hollywood and now.
Exactly.
And that's a great example of that.
Yes.
Getting to meet people like Celeste Holm.
Getting to meet people like Celeste Holm, who worked with the subject of today's podcast episode,
Yes.
Anne Revere.
Yes, as a matter of fact, Celeste Holm beat Anne Revere for the Best Supporting Actress for one particular movie, which I think we're both big fans of.
Yes, yes. Gentleman's Agreement. I was only turned on to Gentleman's Agreement within maybe the last 15 years, and it is truly one of the best films in our American film history.
I completely agree. And I think it's one of the most important films ever made about anti-Semitism.
So Gregory Peck plays a journalist who poses as a Jew to research an expose on anti-Semitism.
Yes.
Talk about a timely subject
Oh.
in the world we're living in now. And who would think that we would still be struggling with this?
It resonates today based on what we're experiencing politically, if you ask me.
It really does. Anne Revere plays Gregory Peck's mother.
Yes, and so beautifully. You know, the movie itself, it already had such pedigree. It was, you know, it came out in 1947. It was directed by Elia Kazan. Not only did it star Atticus Finch himself, Gregory Peck.
Right.
It also starred Dorothy McGuire, the incredible Dorothy McGuire, and John Garfield. And
June Havoc.
June Havoc, baby June.
Jane Wyatt.
Yes.
Yeah.
And also, as Gregory Peck's son, a very young Dean Stockwell, who was amazing in this movie. But for me, Gentleman's Agreement is such an important movie, and for all the incredible performances, the one that had the biggest impact on me as a kid was Anne Revere as the mother. I think she was the moral compass of that movie.
Yeah, she really was. In fact, she reads the expose that Gregory Peck's character writes and reads some of it in the film. And then she has an incredibly powerful monologue that she gives right after reading the article. And I think we have a clip of that for our listeners to hear.
Your father would have liked to have you say that, Phil.
Not enough of us realize it, Ma. Time's getting short. Not enough people, and the time's running out.
You know something, Phil? I suddenly want to live to be very old. Very. I want to be around to see what happens. The world is stirring in very strange ways. Maybe this is the century for it. Maybe that's why it's so troubled. Other centuries had their driving forces. What will ours have been when men look far back to it one day? Maybe it won't be the American century after all, or the Russian century, or the atomic century. Wouldn't it be wonderful, Phil, if it turned out to be everybody's century? when people all over the world, free people, found a way to live together. I'd like to be around to see some of that, even the beginning. I may stick around for quite a while.
What an incredible speech.
Whew.
Yes. You know, to me, that speech epitomized what a good citizen and a decent human being should be.
Yes.
It just conveyed such proud patriotism and decency. It really was just the heart and soul of that movie. And the way she delivered it was incredible. And even though your beloved Celeste Holm won the Oscar, for my money, I would have given the Oscar to Anne Revere that year just for that speech alone.
And thank God she did win.
Yes, she did.
In a prior year.
She'd won a couple of years prior playing Elizabeth Taylor's mother in National Velvet.
Right. So we don't have to say Oscar fumbled, but maybe.
And it's really heartbreaking to me when you see that performance and what an icon of patriotism her performance was. And then 4 years later, her career's over, Anne Revere's, because she was blacklisted in one of the darkest, most shameful periods of American history, which was the witch hunt of the House Un-American Activities Committee.
Right. The committee was headed by Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy.
Yes. A nobody senator, by the way, who decided that he was going to make this his cause. He was going to run out all the commies in Hollywood. That he took that on.
What's interesting, too, in terms of Anne, is what you said about the speech being delivered so beautifully and showing the spirit of patriotism, but the fact that she was also a distant relative of American Revolution hero Paul Revere.
Isn't that great?
So it's kind of like, really? This doesn't get me anything? I'm still going to be accused?
Exactly. My career's still going to be ended. For people who don't know much about Anne Revere, I really encourage you to check out her body of work. But, you know, she was born in 1903 in New York. She wanted to be an actress her whole life, and she really believed in herself. But nobody else did, apparently, because she tried out for high school plays. She tried out for college plays at Wellesley, where she went to college. She couldn't get arrested. So she kind of gave up the dream for a minute when she was a young girl, and she started teaching drama at the prestigious Horace Mann School in Manhattan, where my friend Marcia Hunt went. Again, it's all connected, all weirdly connected. But after a couple years of teaching, she really decided she was going to give acting a real serious go. So she joined the American Laboratory Theater in Manhattan under the tutelage of the great Maria Ospinskaya.
And she is a force.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And if you look her up, listeners, you will recognize her face.
Yeah, she just had that great character-y face. But most people probably know her best. She was actually Oscar nominated twice. Once was for Dodsworth, the Western directed by William Wyler, but also, and I think this is where most people know her from, she played Charles Boyer's sympathetic grandmother who knew that Irene Dunne was the right woman for him in Love Affair in 1939, which was remade as An Affair to Remember years later with Cary Grant and Deborah Kerr.
Right, right. Now, Anne started in the theater, another theater baby, like we talked about with Peter Duell last week.
Yeah, that was her one, I think her true love was theater. And she didn't have much luck at first, so she joined this theater company in Ohio. She got some experience. She started getting cast. So she came back to Broadway with a lot more confidence, and she had some great success. One of the first plays she did was in 1933. It was called Double Door. It ran for quite a while. It became so popular that Hollywood decided to make it into a film. So they invited Anne and another actress in the play, Mary Morris, to come to Hollywood to reprise their roles, which basically was Anne's screen debut in a movie called Double Door in 1934.
Now, I understand there's a story behind that, in that when she saw herself on the big screen when the film was released.
Yes, she stayed in Hollywood after she filmed her part, and she, thought she would tool around and see if she could break into pictures, as one does. And they finally released the movie. She went to see it. She saw her face on the huge big screen. She immediately bought a one-way ticket back to New York.
Well, whether she should have done that or not, because I think she's a beautiful woman, but
yes.
She certainly must have had some instinct that New York had something for her. And she lands a part in a little play by a little playwright named Lillian Hellman, and the play was The Children's Hour, which is one of my favorite plays.
Yes.
And she originates the role of Martha in that.
Yeah, there was something about New York that drew her. You're absolutely right. I don't think it was her time in Hollywood. She had bigger things to do in New York. And besides being in the play, she also met her husband, who was writer-director Samuel Rosen, about the same time she did The Children's Hour. So she came back to good stuff in New York.
And she was not an actress who went through a number of husbands, as we've seen from some of our other starlets.
Yes, she would not be in our Love of Webb episode.
She would not be. She was true blue. So she does Lillian Hellman's play, and Lillian is going to come back in a couple of different ways in Anne's life.
In very prolific ways, yes.
Yes. But the success of the Children's Hour does bring her back to Hollywood. Is that right?
It did. Once people saw her in the Children's Hour, Hollywood became interested all of a sudden. So they basically called for her, and she came back. And she started out independently. She wasn't with a studio, but, she started booking nice supporting roles. She was in The Howards of Virginia in 1940, which starred Cary Grant and Martha Scott. A year after that, she was co-starring with Boris Karloff in The Devil's Command. So she was starting to make a name for herself in Hollywood. But they were kind of a funny couple in Hollywood, she and Samuel Rosen. They were both very pragmatic. They were very modest. They lived in a very modest home in the Hollywood Hills. She wore slacks and did her own housework and didn't go out and didn't party, which was an oddity back in those days.
I'm sure it was. I think I love her. I wish I could have hung out with her.
My kind of gal, for sure.
Exactly.
Shortly after starting to book parts, she got a 6-month contract at MGM, the great MGM.
Right.
But they basically wasted her. They put her in bits. They didn't really give her much to do, except there's one movie, Men of Boys Town, in 1941, which of course starred Spencer Tracy because it was the follow-up to his 1938 iconic film Boys Town. And she has one little scene, and she is so amazing in this scene that it really gave you an idea of the depth this woman has as an actress.
What I love about watching her work on film is the stillness that she has. She really is a great film actress, but can also do theater.
Yes.
And not everyone can do both. You mentioned Men of Boys Town. Here's a clip of that speech that she has.
I heard you were here, Father. I just had to see you. This horrible place, it must be wiped out, Father. You must stay here and help wipe it out. And I'll know that my boy went for some reason. You'll do it, Father. You won't leave Marysport till you've done it, promise.
Well, I'm needed at Boys Town at present. A promise.
No. If you go something else, there'll be something else. You must help the boys here, Father. You must.
Again.
Powerful stuff.
Very powerful. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about her experience with Marlene Dietrich.
Well, this is a great story because after her MGM contract was over, she began to freelance again. And so she worked for Universal on a film called The Flame of New Orleans in 1941.
My.
A spicy title. But the star was Marlene Dietrich. She was notoriously competitive with other women on set.
And isn't it funny? She's like the last person that would need to be competitive, right?
Exactly. So one day they're filming a scene and Miss Dietrich stops the take, and she decided that Anne Revere's neckline was lower than hers, and she was not having it. So they had to adjust Anne's costume a little bit so it was a little higher neckline, and then they continued. But a weird and horrible thing that Anne Revere talked about years later in a 1970 interview with After Dark magazine, she said that on that picture, an AD told her, and this is a quote, "You're homely enough to share the same frame with Dietrich." Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
That assistant director would be fired today.
Yeah. Welcome to Hollywood.
Yeah, welcome to Hollywood.
That is horrible. But imagine what that did to her psychologically. I mean, I can't imagine.
And there are some films that I have seen her in researching this, where she's almost made to look unattractive.
Yes.
She, as I said, she's a handsome woman.
Yes. I think she's a lot like Gail Sondergaard. They purposely made her look uglier than she probably was for the character.
Yeah.
I think that's what they did to Anne Revere. But it didn't slow Anne Revere down. I mean, she kept booking parts in really great movies. She was starring with Claudette Colbert and John Payne and Remember the Day and Designed for Scandal with Rosalind Russell and Walter Pidgeon, The Gay Sisters with Barbara Stanwyck and George Brenn, and my favorite, Geraldine Fitzgerald. And she also has a really great meaty part in Old Acquaintance with Betty Betty Davis and Miriam Hopkins, and can't imagine what the stories were like on that set.
I wonder. I hope that was not oil and vinegar. I hope that those were 2-3 strong women who appreciated each other.
Well, notoriously, Betty Davis and Miriam Hopkins hated each other even more than Joan Crawford and Betty Davis.
Really?
It was probably the biggest feud in Hollywood, including Joan and Betty.
Okay,
they hated each other.
We might have to talk about that on another episode.
Yes.
Let's move into the period of her career where you dub her Hollywood's mother.
Well, it's interesting because once she started getting these high-profile mother roles, that's when she became a star. People remember her probably from The Song of Bernadette, where she played Jennifer Jones's doubting mother, which won her first of her 3 Academy Award nominations. And she went on to play Elizabeth Taylor's mother a few years later in National Velvet, which she finally won the Oscar for. So she played these high-profile mothers and finally became a recognizable star in Hollywood. So I call it the mother years, which were very good to her.
The other thing that I was fascinated by, and it goes back to her roots in the theater, that she was appalled by the lack of good theater in Los Angeles at that time, because there's some amazing theater in Los Angeles happening right now in 2023. And she and her husband formed the Phoenix Westwood Theater Company in 1945.
Yes, they did, which was really ahead of its time, I think, for actors to take that on and really create their own theater companies, which I think is incredible. So after her mother phase, as I call it, her career really began gaining momentum. She was in The Keys of the Kingdom with Gregory Peck, who she would be in later with Gentleman's Agreement. And that was actually Gregory Peck's first Oscar nomination, was the movie The Kings of the Kingdom in 1945. She starred in Otto Preminger's noir classic Fallen Angel as Alice Faye's sister, who was justifiably skeptical of that grifter Dana Andrews.
Dana Andrews.
And she was also in Dragonwyck with Gene Tierney, which was directed by Joseph Mankiewicz. So she really starting to get great roles, really high profile, and really starting to come into her own.
So she's got this theater. She's coming into her own. 1947 is going to be a banner year for her. 3 films in 1 year.
That was her year. And I think 1947, it's an example of some of her finest work. To begin with, she is in Forever Amber, which was this salacious, scandalous novel that had been turned into this very glossy movie at 20th Century Fox starring Linda Darnell. And Anne has a really important part as this friend that sort of takes the scandalous Amber under her wings and kind of helps her out. And, it's a huge hit for everybody, huge exposure for Anne Revere. And then also in 47, she did what might be one of my favorite performances of hers, and it was in Body and Soul, which was directed by Robert Rosen, was written by Abraham Polonsky, where Revere plays Anna Davis, who's this saintly mother whose son, played by John Garfield, is pulled into the underbelly of corruption in his quest to become a heavyweight boxing champ. And she's so square-jawed and strong and good, and it's just such a great performance.
Right.
And then the third is the aforementioned Gentleman's Agreement. With Gregory Peck. So that was just, I would say, the peak of her career. It was just, she was at her finest.
But things were about to change dramatically for Anne. So before we get into that, right now it's time for this week's Hollywood Pop Quiz. Steve.
So the pop quiz today in honor of Anne Revere. In 1944, she appears with William Powell and Myrna Loy in one of the Thin Man movies. Which movie was it?
Oh, I love the Thin Man movies. All right, we'll have the answer to that and more stories about Anne Revere after this.
Back to Steve and Ann in a minute. But now another stop on the Hollywood tour. Lassie, the most famous canine in film history, was first portrayed by a male rough collie named Pal. Now, since Lassie was a girl, it took careful camera work to keep the secret. Following his film debut as Lassie, Pal made 6 more Lassie films for MGM from the mid-1940s to early 50s. He also toured the country, appearing in shows, fairs, and rodeos before starring in the 2 pilots filmed in 1954 for the television series Lassie. After the pilots, Pal retired. He sired a line of descendants who continued to play the fictional character he originated. And now, back to Steve and Ann from Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
So we teased this gathering storm for really Hollywood and the country.
I think we mentioned it earlier. It was one of the darkest, most horrible times in American history, and it's the Blacklist. It's the horrible witch hunt that this nothing senator, Joseph McCarthy, took on as his cause. The whole thing really started in 1946 when Billy Wilkerson, who was the editor of the trade paper, The Hollywood Reporter, he began a series of columns where he would list suspected communists and sympathizers. He called it Billy's List. And I guess he thought he was trying to help Hollywood by eradicating these people. This took on a life of its own, and McCarthy found out about it and decided that he was going to take it upon himself to clean Hollywood up. So he got Congress to agree to form the House Un-American Activities Committee, which would investigate if there really were communists in Hollywood. This was all because of this Hollywood Reporter editor's column, which is how the whole thing started. So some of the names listed, there were 10 writers and directors that were specifically listed. They were called before the committee. They refused to testify.
And they became known as the Hollywood 10.
Absolutely. They were the Hollywood 10. So they were all charged with contempt of court, and they were sentenced to 6 months to a year in prison for contempt of court, which was unheard of. It was such a harsh sentence for the crime.
Correct.
And so this is when the hysteria started. This is when everybody was under scrutiny as a potential communist. Or did you ever join the Communist Party, whether you were in or not? Do you have liberal-leaning beliefs? It really became a witch hunt.
And they started subpoenaing actors, writers, directors to testify before the committee in Washington. And as you write in your blog, you were sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah, it was such a rigged game. I mean, it really was. If you testified to clear your name, you had to denounce any affiliation with communism or the Communist Party, but that wasn't enough. You also had to name names. You had to tell the committee people that you suspected were either communists or communist sympathizers. That was the only way to clear your name and continue to work in Hollywood. A lot of people caved. A lot of people just couldn't take it and wanted to have a career, and they named names. A director I really admire, Edward Dmytryk, he named names to save his career. A lot of other people named names. Elia Kazan famously named names. Actor Larry Parks named names. And actor Lee J. Cobb named names. And one of the names he named was Anne Revere.
Okay, I wondered how Anne's name got mentioned. I just want to take this moment, too, to connect Lee J. Cobb to Elia Kazan. Lee J. Cobb originated the role of Willie Loman in Death of a Salesman, written by Arthur Miller, directed by Elia Kazan. And Elia's naming names forever broke that friendship between Arthur Miller and Elia Kazan. So again, this Hollywood web really is connected. What you're saying about people naming names and ruining their careers, one of the things that I read that Orson Welles said during that time period was, friend informed unfriend, not to save their lives, but to save their swimming pools.
Wow.
Which really puts it in a profound context.
Oh, it really does. Those people who name names, they ruined careers, they ruined lives, they ruined livelihoods. I mean, it was just such a dark time in Hollywood.
So Anne is named, and she gets called before the committee in April of 51.
Yes, Anne's called to testify, and on the stand, they ask her if she's a member of the Actors Laboratory Theater. It was a very progressively political theater in the time, and so it was supposedly a hotbed for Reds and commies and things like that. Anne knew that this was a setup, so she declined to answer. They began asking her other questions about organizations that she was affiliated with that the committee felt were subversive. So next she's shown a copy of her supposed Communist Party membership card. And as she once said in an interview, she said, the card had my name typed on it, no signature. And I turned to my lawyer and I said, this is a plant. So she knew. She knew that her back was against the wall. She was in a precarious position. And she gave an interview for the LA Times, I think in 1976. And she said, and this is a quote, I had several choices. I could become an informant. Certainly, I knew many avowed communists. I could take the fifth. Or I could say, up yours and go to jail, which is what I really wanted to do. It was all over in minutes. But it was like getting your head cut off. You knew you'd never work again.
And she did go on to work again, but who knows those lost years, what work she would have produced and what a gift she could have been in film and in the theater.
She didn't work in film again until 1970.
Right, so that's a huge amount of time, almost over 20 years.
Yeah, I think her salvation was, again, the theater, her first love. That's what saved her.
And one of the connections that she has to another person who famously testified is Lillian Hellman. We talked about her originating the role in The Children's Hour. Lillian Hellman famously went before the committee, and one of her famous quotes of hers is, "I cannot and will not cut my conscience to fit this year's fashions."
That's powerful.
And as we'll find out later, Lillian Hellman comes back into Anne Revere's life in a really wonderful way.
Really throws her a lifeline. It's interesting. Well, after the trial, Anne knew she was in trouble. She knew her career was over, but she had high hopes that she had just shot a film, which is now iconic. She had shot A Place in the Sun, which she played Montgomery Clift's very religious mother, which I think a lot of you remember that. It was directed by George Stevens. But according to Revere, after she testified before the committee, Paramount, in some fit of patriotism, went in the editing room and cut her part down to the bone. So a lot of her greatest scenes were cut out of the movie. And George Stevens, he fought for her. He really tried to stop it, but his hands were tied contractually, so he couldn't stop it. It was a machine.
And not only that, but she was also forced to resign from the Screen Actors Guild Board of Directors. And she told the press upon her resignation, "The producers have decreed that those who stand upon the Fifth Amendment shall forfeit their right to work in the industry."
Yes. That says a lot, doesn't it?
It does say a lot. And just as a little note, if anyone's wondering, nearly 300 actors and others in the industry were blacklisted, and HUAC was only dissolved in 1975.
Isn't that unbelievable?
That committee was around until 1975.
Unbelievable. Anne Revere was not a communist. I mean, she had no interest in communism. She knew nothing about communism. I think she was liberal-leaning. But she has another great quote. She said years later, she said, "I got to know communists, and communism I knew wasn't for me. I'm a free-thinking Yankee rebel, and nobody's going to tell me what to do." And I think that's probably what got her in trouble.
Yeah.
It wasn't about being a communist. It was just about being a free-thinking, strong-willed woman back in those days.
And if she were alive today and able to be that person that she was back then, how amazing that would be.
How absolutely amazing. Fortunately, she went back to New York. She went back to her love. She went back to the salvation of the theater. She took anything she could get to survive, off Broadway, anything to keep her acting chops sharp, which served her well later because things took a turn for her in 1960.
Yes, they did, with Lillian Hellman's play Toys in the Attic. What a time that must have been. Directed by Arthur Penn, starring Jason Robards, Maureen Stapleton, Irene Worth, and Anne Revere.
Well, she won the Tony.
She won the Tony. That's the
Talk about
best revenge.
Success is the best revenge. So good for her.
I love it. And I did watch her speech you have posted on your blog. I love that she thanked her husband. You could tell that that was really heartfelt, and that she said she wouldn't be here without him. It just made me teary to think that after all that she'd been through, she was being celebrated by the theater.
Yeah, I love that so much. And I love that they didn't keep her down. She succeeded despite everything.
Right.
Which says a lot about her, I think.
Right. She actually performed throughout her career in a total of 11 Broadway shows, including As You Like It.
Yes,
so she was a Shakespeare girl as well.
She was. She knew her stuff.
But she does end up getting back to Hollywood in the 70s.
She does. It was a stage director named Joe Hardy who got her back into film and television in a soap opera called A Time for Us. But she always credits him for giving her another start in film and TV. And in 1970, her old pal Otto Preminger was making the movie Tell Me You Love Me, Junie Moon with Liza Minnelli.
Liza Minnelli, yeah.
And offered her a nice supporting part in it, which really put her back on the map in Hollywood.
Now, she runs into an old friend, Lee J. Cobb.
She does. After the Preminger movie, she is cast in a Western called Macho Callahan with David Janssen, Gene Seberg, and her old pal, E.J.
Oh
Cobb.
boy, I gotta say, that would be just putting myself in her shoes. I don't know. You'd have to maybe keep me away from him.
Yes, this is the guy who named her name, ruined her career, stopped everything. But, reflecting back on it, she said, I hold nothing against Lee. In a sense, he was as much a victim of blacklisting as I was. We merely followed separate roads.
Wow.
That just told you a lot about her and her heart and her sense of forgiveness.
It really does. Another quote that you found from her in a 1970 interview is really something I think we can all take away. Anytime tragedy or something happens in our lives and we don't understand why, she talks about the experience of being blacklisted. And she says, it's an experience I wouldn't have missed. You never know yourself until you've been tested. I didn't destroy my image of myself. There's nothing like getting your head cut off to find that you've got no more questions about yourself. And then she goes on to say that she couldn't have played Mother Courage in 1964 without that blacklist experience.
Isn't that amazing?
I mean, this is a woman that...
She could have been so bitter, so jaded, so angry, and she wasn't.
Yeah. And she went on to do really great work.
And the $6 Million Man in Beretta.
I mean, come on. That alone, right?
Gotta love a gal who appears on the $6 Million Man in Beretta. But she did. She continued to have a really lovely TV career. She appeared on Ryan's Hope, the soap opera, for a while. And, she finally settled in Massachusetts with Samuel and lived a nice, quiet, peaceful life until they both passed.
Well, as we look back at the Red Scare that swept through Hollywood in the 40s and 50s, I think it's important that we're talking about it again now.
Absolutely. Pay attention to history, folks. Pay attention to history.
Amen to that. Well, I think we need to reveal the answer to our Hollywood pop quiz.
Yes, and the question was, in honor of Anne Revere, she appeared in a 1944 Thin Man movie with William Powell and Myrna Loy. Which Thin Man movie was it? It was The Thin Man Goes Home.
Oh!
And it's a great movie, and it's a really great part for her. She plays this gun-toting recluse named Crazy Mary. And she's great. So it's a really different role for her, and it's a lot of fun. So you should check it out.
I am going to check it out, and I now have a new favorite actress in Anne Revere.
Oh, very, very good choice.
Well, that's another episode.
Yeah, in the books.
Thanks so much for listening.
If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. Please email us at info@frombeneaththehollywoodsign.com, because we have a lot of great stories coming up, so please help spread the word.
Thanks again for listening. That's this week's View.
From Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
You've been listening to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign with Steve Cubine and Ann McNamara, the podcast that celebrates amazing stories of Tinseltown from its golden era. Join us next week for another episode and learn something else about Hollywood you probably never knew. Take a moment and give us a 5-star rating and a positive review, and tell your friends about us too. It'll help grow the podcast. Visit Steve's website at FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com. The executive producers are Steve Cubine and Nan McNamara. Executive producer and post-production supervisor Lindsay Schnebley. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows like The Box of Oddities and The Shallow End with Schnebley and Toth. Copyright 2023. All rights reserved. That's a wrap.